You're listening to Sportly, an Immigrantly media production. It's a hot summer evening in San Francisco in 1999. Tony Hawk is at the top of a vert ramp, and he's already blown this trick 10 times tonight. The San Diego native is about to split skateboarding history in two, landing a trick that, until this moment, has seemed more myth than reality. The trick is called the 900, and it requires 2.5 spins in the air, something nobody has ever landed before in competition. Today, on June 27th, after a decade on Hawk's wish list, this seemingly impossible trick is finally ready to be checked off. This is the moment that Hawk would carve his name into X Games and skateboarding history. He's been chasing it in practice for years, at the cost of a concussion, broken ribs, and a couple of teeth. But by his own account, he wasn't even planning to try it tonight. He'd only planned to do a varial 720. But then, the announcer prompts him from the mic, and the crowd goes crazy for the idea.
It's the 900.
The competition is technically over, but the crowd isn't letting him give up. Nor are the other skaters, who seem just as keen on his success as Tony is. In an interview later, he says,
I was either going to make it or get taken away in an ambulance. Those are the only two ends to that evening for me.
So despite his tiredness and the sweat drenching him, Tony drops in one more time. He races up one side of the ramp and springs into his spins. Once, twice, 3 times. Then he lands, and the cheers from the crowd drown all the other sounds out.
When I made it, I saw all my peers rushing towards me, and it was like that made it real.
Mind you, this was really before social media. There was no YouTube or Snapchat, TikTok, Instagram. If you weren't in the crowd or watching ESPN Live, the only way you would have heard about this was somebody telling you. But somehow, within a few days, the story had spread far beyond the skateboarding world. That night didn't just make Tony Hawk a legend. It turned the X Games into something ESPN probably never had anticipated. 27 years later, the X Games are still here. The event has changed, disappeared from the calendar at times, and reinvented itself more than once. But in an era where most teenagers find their favorite action sports stars on a vertical app, is there still a place for the X Games? We're going to find out in this episode.
He's at 18. He's got it. He's got it.
There we go.
History in the making.
Hey everyone, it's Kavitha Davidson, and welcome back to Sportly. The X Games were once the biggest stage in action sports, bringing skateboarding, BMX, motocross, and more disciplines together, putting them in front of the world. There was a time when landing a trick at ESPN's X Games was the highest honor an action sports athlete could earn. Kids around the world didn't just tune in for hours. They wanted to be part of the phenomenon.
X Games, to me, growing up, was the pinnacle. It was like the biggest thing you could possibly do.
Skateboards under their arms, scrapped up knees, baggy clothes, dreaming that one day their names would be called at the X Games. This story starts with an idea that seemed almost impossible. Bring together a group of sports that had never had a seat at the table with baseball, basketball, or certainly football. That idea would go on to shape an entire generation of kids. But then the world changed. The internet transformed the way we watch sports, and suddenly athletes had a direct line to their audience. The giant ESPN had built was facing a new kind of threat. Not another competition, but the phone sitting in the pocket of every fan. 2 decades after Tony Hawk helped put the X Games on top of the action sports world, the competition has launched a new initiative to win back some of the ground it lost, or at least prove it still has a place in the future of sports. In the early 90s, ESPN was so popular that they were launching ESPN2, and they needed a filler program to put on that channel. Ron Samayo, an ESPN executive, noticed that action sports and extreme sports, skateboarding and the like, were so popular among the youth, but didn't really have a home on network or cable television. So in June 1995, ESPN rolled the dice on something they called the Extreme Games. Skateboarding, BMX, street luge, bungee jumping, sports that, up until then, mostly lived in parking lots or someone's backyard, not on television screen. ESPN executive Ron Samayo saw commercials for these sports and noticed how much Gen X actually cared about them, and that they were an underserved but highly lucrative young demographic. So in June of 1995, ESPN rolled the dice on something they called the Extreme Games. Skateboarding, BMX, street luge, bungee jumping, sports that up until then mostly lived in parking lots or somebody's backyard, but not on TV screens. Almost 200,000 people showed up across Rhode Island and Vermont to watch it happen, and even ESPN didn't see that coming.
Welcome to the first Extreme Games. Along with Susie Calver, I'm Chris Fowler.
The first edition was better than anyone could have imagined. So the following year, ESPN rebranded the event. The Extreme Games became the X Games, and what had started as a one-off experiment quickly started looking like a franchise. For his part, Ron Samayo, the ESPN executive behind the creation of the X Games, knew who he was targeting when he came up with them.
The idea really came from noticing how much of a movement there was going on in youth culture, bringing these sports together under a big umbrella of competition as well as culture to showcase these tremendous abilities.
Then in 1997, the Winter X Games arrived. Snowboarding, ice climbing, snow mountain biking, an entire new roster of sports suddenly under the same roof. And then came the moment that changed everything. I already told you about how it happened. In 1999, Tony Hawk drew a line through skateboarding history. On one side was everything that came before the 900. On the other was everything that came after. What that achievement proved was that action sports had the power to create cultural icons of their own. Hawk stopped being just a skateboarder that people admired. And then his rapid rise to household fame was supercharged in late '99 with the release of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater.
Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. Now everyone thinks they can skate like Tony. Now available on Nintendo 64 and Game Boy Color, rated E for everyone.
This PlayStation game became a massive pop culture phenomenon, introducing millions of kids to skateboarding tricks, punk rock soundtracks, and skate culture. It didn't just sell tens of millions of copies across its franchise, it transformed Hawk from an action sports icon into a global video game legend, cementing his name in mainstream pop culture for an entire generation.
Hey, everybody, welcome back to the show. Folks, you know my next guest because he is the most famous skateboarder of all time. Please welcome back to The Late Show, Tony Hawk.
After that, he became a spokesperson that brands wanted through and through. Jeep sought him, so did Doritos, Mountain Dew, McDonald's. In 2001, Nickelodeon ran a poll for your favorite male athlete, and Tony Hawk won. He beat Kobe, he beat Shaq, he beat Tiger. A skateboarder ahead of three of the biggest names in American sports, catering mostly to the young demographic. And if that wasn't enough, Hawk made a cameo on The Simpsons in 2003, joining a pretty elite club of Springfield visitors, alongside some names you might have heard of, like Michael Jackson, Paul McCartney, and Sir Ian McKellen.
You're going down, Homer, then back up, then down, and back up again. That's how the game is played.
If you were a kid back then, seeing your hero show up on The Simpsons was the highest honor. And Hawk wasn't the only one. The late Dave Mirra dominated BMX parks for years, getting to the point where fans already knew that he was going to win no matter who else was in the competition. The gap between his skills and everyone else's was just impossible to ignore. Then there was Travis Pastrana, who made Moto X feel like theater. In 2006, he landed a double backflip that people genuinely thought would kill him before he actually stuck it. A few years later, Shaun White did to snowboarding what Tony Hawk had done to skating a decade before. 15 gold medals and a level of dominance that made him a household name outside the sport entirely. These guys weren't just athletes anymore. They were icons and characters, the faces that you would find on a lunchbox or a video game cover or your cousin's bedroom wall.
You're like the rock and roller of the Olympics.
Yeah.
That was the trick that ESPN pulled off. The X Games wasn't just about who could land the hardest move. For a while, they were the only stage where action sports athletes could truly push the limits of what was possible. And then came social media.
Hi, YouTube. This is Chad and Steve. We're the co-founders of the site.
YouTube launched in 2005, and suddenly you could watch your favorite tricks in grainy, homemade videos just on your computer. Despite the poor video quality, clips of extreme sports recorded by amateurs began to go viral. And soon, pro athletes were recording their own practice runs, and fans no longer had to wait for the next X Games to watch them break records and land impossible new tricks. Athletes were now able to reach fans directly and build audiences of their own without the infrastructure of cable TV. Before, you also had to wait a year for the next X Games to see if your favorite BMX rider had leveled up. Now, that time had shrunk to however long it took an athlete to post a video on YouTube.
For me, social media is a natural extension of what I've always done as a pro skater. I've always tried to take my skating direct to my audience and not go through other filters.
Social media is given.
The emotional engine of the X Games was the anticipation of, will they land at this time? And that entire situation got handed directly to the internet. The X Games was still the biggest stage in action sports. It just wasn't the only place where the biggest moments could happen anymore. And here's the strange thing. If you had walked the grounds at an X Games in those years, you probably wouldn't have thought anything was wrong. In 2014, ESPN moved the Summer X Games to Austin, Texas. 160,000 people came through the gates over 4 days. That was a 74% jump from LA the year before. The next year in Austin, they did 160,000 again. But that same 2014 event, the one with the record crowd, saw ESPN's television ratings fall 31% from the year before. Some of that was just the calendar. The games had moved from late July to early June to dodge the Texas heat, and June is a harder month to hold an audience. The X Games then moved to Minneapolis in 2017 into US Bank Stadium, the first NFL stadium ever to host it. 110,000 fans came to watch their favorite athletes over the course of the tournament, and the following year, 119,000. Crowds were solid and the sponsors were happy. But on TV, 2017 was the lowest rated Summer X Games in the history of the event. It was down 35% in a single year. Then in 2019, it averaged 623,000 viewers across ESPN, ESPN2, and ABC, the lowest in at least 2 decades. When you put those two lines next to each other, you can see the problem exactly. The X Games could still fill a stadium, but it could no longer fill a broadcast. Money was another part of the equation. X Game prize purses offered real money on top of the prestige. Brands started paying athletes for more than their results. They were paying for their image, their audience, and the attention that they could bring to a brand. That shift happened across sports, from enormous soccer transfers to multi-million-dollar endorsement deals. An athlete's value is no longer just about what they can do on the field, court, or skate park. It's also about what their name can bring with them. A skateboarder with a strong social media presence could earn more over a year than someone who had actually stood on the podium at major competitions. And that changed the incentive. You didn't have to land the hardest tricks in front of thousands of people to build a career, sacrificing your body in the process. If you could build an audience, a post could be worth more to a sponsor than a podium finish. So why plan your entire year around one competition when brands were paying for reach and not just results? Social media gave skaters a direct line to these companies without having to go through the competition circuit first. Steve Barrera saw that shift firsthand.
Shaun White was already making more money than 99% of the pro skateboarders in the industry and never had a video part as a professional.
So when you combine instant social media access and shifting sponsorship dollars, the X Games were forced into a crossroads. They were no longer the sole gatekeeper of action sports culture. The organization wasn't unaware of what was happening, of course. To keep the X Games relevant, they needed to experiment, and that led to a long period of trial and error that began in the early 2010s. ESPN first tried taking the X Games global with a massive 6-city international schedule in 2013, holding events in Brazil, Spain, and Germany. While that specific joint venture was pulled after a year, the X Games continued heading overseas through local licensing deals, bringing stops to Norway, Sydney, Shanghai, and eventually Chiba, starting in 2022. As we've said, the X Games were pulling massive in-person attendance, but losing viewership on terrestrial television. Today, the X Games have more than 7 million followers across Instagram and TikTok, another sign that the brand still has a strong connection with action sports fans. But by the early 2020s, ESPN had to make some hard decisions. The X Games weren't facing a sudden financial crisis, but a gradual decline in viewership as sports fan consumption patterns shifted away from cable TV to streaming and digital. ESPN sold their majority ownership to a private equity firm in 2022. MSP Sports Capital came in promising to bring fresh investment, technology, and a more aggressive approach to the brand.
Wow, it is the end of an era. ESPN selling its majority interest in the X Games. Now, that doesn't mean...
With new owners came a new strategy, and in 2024, the X Games introduced their biggest idea yet, the X Games League.
We usher in a brand new era of X at our new summer home. Welcome to the party.
Instead of individual athletes simply showing up to compete in annual tournaments, the new format puts them on teams, with athletes selected through a draft and competitions taking place across summer and winter seasons. Fans now had reason to follow the X Games throughout the year, while the athletes themselves could have a more stable career in their sports. Jeremy Bloom, the X Games CEO, explains what they were trying to build.
This is a different way to think about action sports. For the history of forever, it was the US guy versus the French guy, and that's been the Olympic model, the World Cup model, and so forth and so on. This is the first time ever where it's going to be like, well, you have a team in Sao Paulo going against a team in LA. And that LA team has athletes from all over the world, but it's X Games Club LA.
Nyjah Houston, a veteran X Games athlete, shared his thoughts on the new era X Games is entering with Vice Sports.
Nyjah Houston, how are we feeling? First ever X Games draft, red carpet.
Bro, it's trippy, yeah. I mean, us as skateboarders, we're not used to this.
What do you think about this new team?
In 2026, 2 years after the announcement that the X Games would leave behind the timetable we knew and become the X Games League, it was time to see if this new idea could give the brand a strong start, just as the first X Games had done back in 1995. And Sacramento was where it all began. In late June, more than 100 athletes went to California to compete across 18 medal events in skateboarding, BMX, and MotoX. 40 of them competed in one of 4 new teams: New York, Los Angeles, Sao Paulo, and Tokyo. The clubs were named for these cities, but the rosters were pulled from everywhere. And fans showed up. More than 52,000 people filled the venues across 3 days in Sacramento, setting a post-pandemic attendance record for the X Games. After Sacramento, the season moved to Chiba, Japan, and then culminated in the X Games, the championship in New Orleans. In the end, the team from New York beat Tokyo to claim the 2026 summer title.
XC New York, our first ever MoonPay X Games League champions.
Across the season, 18.3 million people watched the XGL on ABC and ESPN, up 78.5% from the summer before. Now, of course, the first season of a new league and format will obviously do higher numbers because of the novelty. The winter season kicks off in LA in September. More than 180 skiers and snowboarders will compete. Sustaining the growth beyond the summer season is the real goal for the X Games League. Back in 1999, Tony Hawk didn't land the 900 for a sponsorship deal. There was no brand waiting on the other side of the trick, just the chance to be remembered. He had spent a decade chasing it, driven by the idea of being the first to land something that had seemed impossible. He had scraped up nearly every part of his body, broken some ribs, and lost a few teeth. But he kept going after failing 10 times in front of thousands of people, with the announcers urging him to try again. And when he finally landed it, everyone watching knew that they had just witnessed something nobody had ever seen before. Almost 3 decades later, athletes no longer need ESPN to reach an audience, a singular event to build a career, or a stadium to find fans. In so many ways, they have more control over their careers and audiences than Tony Hawk did in 1999. For now, the athletes in the XGL seem optimistic that their sport can continue to adapt to an ever-changing media landscape.
It's the ultimate. Achieving a goal that even you almost thought was unattainable at one point. And when you achieve that, there's no greater joy.
Thanks so much for tuning into Sportly. Tune in next week for another great story. If you enjoyed this episode, rate and review us on your favorite podcast app or come tell us on Instagram. You'll find us at SportlyPod. Sportly is an Immigrantly media production. This episode was produced by Paroma Chakravarti. Our executive producer is Sadia Khan. Researched and written by Juan Sebastian Camacho. Our sound designer and editor is Paroma Chakravarti. Our theme music was created by Simon Hutchinson. Other music by Epidemic Sound. Tune back in next week for more Sportly.